levels and across different subject levels as well.
A little bit about us. I'm Cait Farrow. Those are my social media contact information. I've been a teacher at Central Hardin High School for 5 years. I was previously with senior English until now. I am being transferred to sophomore, so that's exciting for me. But I also am Google certified level 2 educator, Flipgrid certified, a Wakelet community member, and a Screencast Genius also. And both Paige and I are part of the Hardin County Schools Innovate Fellowship.
So my name is Paige Wilson, and all of my information is on here as well. And I, too, am an English teacher at Central Hardin. This will be my 3rd year here and my 4th year teaching. So in the past couple of years, I, too, have been with seniors, but I am looking forward to the transition of having some sophomores and freshmen this upcoming school year. So it's going to be interesting to see how all of that pans out and the changes that we make.
Just to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about, much like we do with our students, some objectives for the day. You'll be able to provide a rationale for using podcasts as classroom text, differentiate for students through their use, understand how to implement them in your classroom, and also design a podcast lesson or unit for your content. When we started out our year last year, we got to thinking about specifically our Shakespeare unit with our seniors in teaching Hamlet. This traditionally was a text that we used in the last trimester, the end of the year. And if you all know what it's like for seniors at the end of the year, they are deeply infected with senioritis, and they're not that productive. So when we looked at the standards in Kentucky and the curriculum and everything and that we needed to cover, this past year when Kentucky adopted the new standards for English, they actually took out the Shakespeare requirement, but they left in all of the terminology and the skills that Shakespeare covered. So when we were thinking about, okay, how can we get our seniors engaged but still meet these standards, one thing that came to mind was podcasts. Specifically for us, we used the Serial Season 1 podcast about Anan Saeed, if you know anything about it. If you don't, highly recommend checking it out. But we were like, okay, so what can we do with this? And the stats in 2019 said that 144 million people in the United States, that's 51%, are listening to podcasts or have listened to them. And the breakdown as far as gender goes is pretty equal. On average, 56% male and 44% female. And when they're listening, 80% of people are listening to almost the entire episode of every episode available. So that tells us there's something kind of onto this as far as the engagement goes. So why? We are working really hard as educators every day to make sure our students are a part of this global economy and they're, a well-educated, well-rounded citizen. And currently there are over 525,000 active shows and over 18.5 million episodes available. It's incredibly globally relevant. These countries listed here actually listen to podcasts more than us. So when we are thinking about how we can have global citizens in our classroom, podcast is a way that is reaching everywhere. And when we want them to be engaged, podcasts are designed to do that. They're writing these podcasts so that you keep listening every episode and you listen to the whole episode. So it's using a lot of the tools that we use in a common text to keep them listening and focused.
On this slide, you'll just see some of the benefits for students when listening to a podcast. So, of course, you have the increase in confidence and literacy, which everyone is responsible for teaching reading, teaching writing, and therefore making students more literate. So doing these things, listening and reading at the same time, helps students with word recognition. There are tons of different topics and narrative types. So there are podcasts of every type, length, knowledge level, and topic available on the internet to fit whatever it is you might need. And at the end of this, Caitlin has included a lesson plan for a science unit where they actually start the class listening to a bit of a podcast. You can do it for bell ringers. You can use it as a whole text. There are all kinds of different podcasts for you to use. The increased focus was definitely something that we were looking for when we were switching from Hamlet to the podcast. They're less likely to be distracted when they're listening to a podcast because they're able to read while they're listening. We provided them with the transcript to follow along with. It's designed to pique interest with the sound effects, the interviews, the cliffhangers, all of the things that these producers include for engagement definitely appeal to our students. The biggest reason that we looked at this is because it's free. If you are lacking a budget, which everyone is for textbooks, or you have a copy limit or whatever it might be, podcasts are free and a way to bring content into the classroom. And the kids even have access on their phones. Most of them didn't even realize that the podcast app was already included on their iPhone. The relevancy is also a huge benefit for podcasts with our students. They're continuing to increase in popularity. So we were helping, and we will continue to help students navigate this new type of literacy that maybe they haven't had before. And we practice analyzing it for credibility just as we would with written text. And then finally, the diversity of content that's available. A lot of our textbooks in our classrooms, they lack this. So this was an easy way for us to implement just some different types of text into the classroom and ways to bring in different voices into our rooms as well. So before we started teaching the podcast unit, we were just curious to see if our students' exposure kind of aligned with the statistics of the United States. So in a poll, we asked them if they'd heard of the term podcast before. So you can kind of see the data. 75% said, yes, I've heard of this and I know what it is. And then the other 25% had either heard it, but they didn't know what it was, or they'd never heard of it at all. So 25% of them fit into that category. And then we asked them if they'd ever listened to one themselves, and we got some pretty split data here. But about 44% of our students had never listened to one. And then you can see some of them had listened to one once, some of them listened to them sometimes, but only 10% of them listened to them often. And we do think that after that unit, that's probably changed. And here's a quote from one of my students that I had during the second trimester last year. She loved the discussions that we had about the podcast in class. The content was new and different from the usual.
So just to kind of piggyback off the rationale, this goes back to your educational relevance. We, when we were choosing a podcast, sometimes when we're saying throw out Shakespeare and put in a podcast about somebody convicted of murder, they, you have a time when people are like, you're going to do what? Our beloved Shakespeare? And so this was kind of our way of saying, no, I promise this is important. This is relevant. We need to teach our kids this new literacy. And here's why. And so with the Kentucky standards that came last year, using podcasts is an easy way for every teacher of every content to cover those state reading standards. And in the next slide, we even pulled out some of the specific standards that you could tag on your lesson plans or build into your objective when they're listening to podcasts in your classroom. Especially if you are a non-ELA teacher, this is a great way for you to say you're hitting those standards in your classroom.
Not to mention everybody dies in Hamlet too.
Yeah. I mean, it's just as bloody and gory. So then this question. Okay, this sounds great. And I don't know if you all listen to podcasts. I feel like educators are really up on the podcast because there's so many great ones for educators. But if you've got these ideas or you listening to them in your own time. I know one that I've seen really popular that everybody's listening to or has been was the Bardstown podcast about all the events that happen in Bardstown. And even that one you could bring into the classroom in a lot of ways. But how do we do it? What do we do with it? We just, what do you do? So these are some ideas that you could use. Just using them for quick introductions to content. As like a bell ringer or a 1 day lesson. If your textbook does a really bad job of explaining something, there's a podcast out there that will explain it in a better way, hopefully. Um, you could also teach content and use a podcast to give that opposing view. This is great if you have a textbook about economic policy, but you want to find a current podcast that offers some opposing viewpoints to whatever your textbook says, or maybe you want to find a podcast that has a bunch of interviews for all different viewpoints and suggestions. They're also great for independent research projects. If you're giving kids some leeway to find to research about different things, they can use podcasts as their text for their research, and they can use it to analyze the credibility and the reliability of whatever that podcast is saying, which is something that Paige and I used when we did a conspiracy theory unit. We encouraged and gave them a list of podcasts that they could actually use as a research text. You can also use it as a unit of study taught through the podcast, which is what we did. We studied Serial, the podcast, for an entire unit. And then it's also great for enrichment opportunities for gifted students. If you have a kid in your class who understands something in your content that you have to go over with the rest of your students, you can assign them a podcast that takes them to the next level of mastery, and they can listen to that in class while you are teaching the rest of the kids whatever it is that they need to know. And it's also just a great filler lesson for a fun Friday. If you're a math teacher and you've got this random Friday with your kids because fifth block is a pep rally, and what are you going to do with everyone else? There are podcasts specifically about different math jobs in the real world, things that you would never even think about. So listening to that on a Friday when you've got some extra time is a great way to bring them into the classroom.
So there are several options and ways that you will listen to these podcasts with your students. So obviously you can do the whole class, which is what we did with Serial the second trimester. And that's just simply where all students are listening to that same podcast together in class. They can do it individually, so they're listening independently during class. We do independent reading every single trimester. And like Cait mentioned with the Bardstown podcast, I had a kid who was really struggling to find something that he wanted to read or he wanted to listen to. And he listened to the Bardstown podcast for his independent reading time. And I found out that he was listening to the podcast outside of class, which was definitely heartwarming for an English teacher if kids are reading or wanting to engage in anything that it increases literacy outside of the classroom. And then there's the beyond the classroom, which is where students listen outside of class. So it's kind of like your flipped classroom method. They listen before and then they come in prepared for discussion of whatever they listen to. So that all of these are options. It's just what fits your style and your preference most.
So one of the things we like about podcasts are the differentiation possibilities. Just like traditional text, you can take a podcast for differentiation. So you can assign them different podcasts based on their ability. There are podcasts that discuss things at a longer and deeper level, and you give those to your kids who are at the higher end of understanding, versus the shorter, simpler understanding with a more limited vocabulary for your kids who are really just being introduced to the topic or are struggling. And this is a great way to think about how can we make our learning and our text fit our kids and their needs. If you're familiar with News ELA, where you can choose the Lexile of the text for them, think of this the exact same way. You're basically making the lexile of the podcast fit whatever their understanding and their level of content knowledge is. And then also you can use it as a way of student choice. You can have them find a podcast of their choice based on different sets of requirements. So, guys, I want you all to listen to a podcast that deals with, I can't even think right now, that talks about friction, or find a podcast that is narrative to study the narrative text types, or any kind of thing like that. Or find a podcast, listen to any episode from this podcast, which is what we did with the conspiracy theories. They could pick a podcast from that, any episode from that podcast. There's so many different ways that you can set this up.
So how we knew that they were listening, there were several different things that we did, and it just depends on how your classroom is set up and if you're going to be teaching with the online academy versus in person. But one thing that we did were sketch notes and graphic organizers. So students just kind of take notes or sketch and draw their thoughts while they're listening and reading along with the podcast. We also let them color and doodle. So this was giving up a little bit of control and a little bit of structure that some of you might be used to having, but we just let them kind of sit there and color, and it kept their hands busy, but it really didn't require a whole lot of brain power that would distract them from listening to the podcast. And we actually found some of these coloring and doodle sheets that went along with the podcast that we were teaching. So you could do that for whatever podcast you are choosing to implement in your classroom. And then there is, you could do a back channel chat for students to discuss real time while they're listening to the podcast. So this is something that they would do on their Chromebook while they're listening, and they're just having a discussion about what they're listening to while the podcast is still playing in the room. And then, of course, there are guided notes, which these are kind of old school, but if this is what fits you and your kids the best, then that's always an option, just where you're providing them with specific questions or even topics to make note of while they're listening to the episode.
And with the back channel chat, like, that's something that came about to us because some of the episodes we were listening to, they were like shock, awe, I have something to say about this, but they didn't want to interrupt us while we were listening. So we were able to let them share their thoughts without having to pause and stop or interrupt other people and all that kind of things. And we presented this at the Kentucky Go Digital, and another teacher had said that she actually printed out the transcript for her students, and then they were allowed to draw visuals, like what they were imagining in their head while they were listening on the transcript. So that's another thought too.
The back channel chat is also just good for the students that you have in class that might just not feel comfortable in open floor discussion, but have really great thoughts and really great ideas, where they feel a little bit more comfortable in adding them on their computer screen.
So how do we know if they're understanding? What's the comprehension? And honestly, you assess podcasts just like normal. So you can use exit slips, write a summary, open-ended discussions, quick writes. And we actually did vocabulary instruction just like we normally would within the podcast. So we pulled out words that they might not know. We pre-tested them on it and focused on it while we listened. And we linked the assignment to that there if you wanted to check that out. But also, in summative ways, if you're using this for like a unit, we actually had our students create a podcast based on the one that they listened to. So they had to learn about the formatting. They had to learn about how to bring in evidence and how to interview and all of these things that they heard model podcasts do, and do it in their own podcast. We actually had them find another crime that was committed that was controversial and then present both sides of it, just like it does in Serial. So that's an option. You can have them create a follow-up episode or a season 2. What would come next? And then also, why should students listen to this podcast? So if you're thinking about did this go well? Ask your students. Have them write a rationale for either continuing to keep this in the curriculum or, hey, this podcast left out XYZ, so I don't think it's a good resource, or whatever it may be. They can write to you, they can write to the school board, or, site-based decision-making council, whoever decides your curriculum. They can write to, future students, whatever it may be. Or you can just test them like a traditional quiz test, pencil paper. It's totally up to you. But whatever you do, you can focus on any type of comprehension question you would normally ask when you're thinking about putting something in front of them to read and understand.
We had mentioned earlier the Wakelet that we included. So if you open that link, like I said, there are several different resources for you if you are looking for podcasts to implement in your classroom, along with rationales that can kind of support or help you think of the standards that you'd like to cover while you are creating your podcast unit. So this is taking forever to load, but once it gets here, there are podcasts listed for different contents and different grade levels. So we have things for math on here, science podcasts. Of course, we have ones for English, elementary, whatever it is that you might be teaching. We try to find some of a podcast that could fit whatever it is that you might be doing. And then, of course, podcasts are available online, and they're free most of the time, which is why we implemented them in our classroom. And when we made the switch to NTI, it was really easy to just continue our podcast unit. So that could be another reason why you might want to start thinking about implementing podcasts this year. So they're available through independent websites, Apple Music. A lot of the kids even have the podcast app already on their iPhone. They just might not know that they have that app, so you might have to show them that they do. Several of mine were shocked that I knew that they had something on their phone that they didn't. Of course, Spotify, Google Play, and then there are other apps that they can use as well.
And when we're going to talk about how we did this, but we really like them for a lot of reasons. And the breakdown and sharing it with others is because there were kids in our classroom who we could not engage in any way, shape, or form. And you all know those kids. And when we pulled up the podcast and they were listening to it, it was like a whole new student in our classroom. And it was probably a mix of the fact that they got to listen to something instead of sit down and read it, because some of our kids just get really frustrated, even at the senior level, trying to read something, whether they're interested in it or not. But also the content, and it was just something new that they hadn't heard, and they were super excited that they were doing something that the seniors last year didn't get to do, and it was just really exciting for us to see. And then they went on to even share podcasts with us that they were listening to in their free time. Like, have you heard about this? And several of our kids started listening to Serial season 2 and were like, oh my gosh, have you listened to season 2 yet? And that just kind of hits us in a way that, educators get all warm and fuzzy. But we kind of had another aha moment for them whenever they started making their own podcast. And these are what these additional resources are for. We used Anchor FM, which is great. It's easy to use on Chromebooks. You don't need a microphone. You don't need anything extra. So if you have Chromebooks, they're perfect for that. They just go to that website and they can create their own podcast about literally anything if you want to use it for an assignment. So for us, we were asking them to, just like the Serial podcast, to use evidence to support both sides of the argument of whether or not somebody was guilty or innocent. And this is kind of what was awe-inspiring for us, because they wanted to just write this script out and read the script. And we gave them a time limit that seemed really out of reach for them. And they could not figure out how we could expect them to do that long. And when we learned that they were just writing the script and reading it, we were like, okay, wait a second. Go back to the podcast that we listened to. Did they just read from a script? And they were like, no. And so why are you? Have you done the research? Yes, we've done the research. So if I ask you right now, why do you think he's guilty? Could you tell me? Yeah. And they just started having this conversation. And it was like, okay, well, do that on the podcast, because that's what they're doing. They're just talking about it. They're just interviewing each other. Make it feel like we're right there in the room having this conversation with you. And that was kind of like an aha moment for them when they started putting their podcast together. So that's really kind of cool to see how they can transform their learning and the research they've done into different mediums. Because, they're going to do a podcast and write it differently than they would write a paper. But just with the research paper, their skills that they learned from listening to the podcast translated to their writing. So we noticed in their paper that they weren't just throwing out evidence at us anymore. They were able to explain the evidence and how their evidence supported whatever statements they were making. And that's something that they lacked before we listened to the podcast. And I mean, I guess I can't say it's correlation without causation, but I really feel like they were hearing those models of people explaining the evidence and working through them, and that it directly translated to their writing skills. Do you want to talk about the student contest?
Sure. So as they were creating these podcasts and they were posting them to Anchor FM, they knew that we were going to listen to them as their summative assessment for this podcast unit. And they knew that their friends were going to listen to the podcast, or a couple episodes of the podcast that they created. But another authentic audience that was available for them was submitting their podcasts to this New York Times annual student contest, which a lot of them did. And so it gave them a reason to make the podcast the best that it could be, other than just for the grade, knowing that they had an authentic audience who was really going to listen to their podcast and what they had to say really seemed to be motivating and help with engagement with our seniors, which, like Cait said before, if you have ever had a senior in Part B, especially in the third trimester of school, they are the farthest thing from engaged and motivated, no matter what you do. But this really seemed to help.
And so, go on to the next one, Paige. This is a sample lesson plan that I kind of threw together. And I said I teach English, so don't judge me. This is a chemistry lesson that I worked really hard on. So I just took an objective from the Kentucky Science Standards that said I can determine which materials have properties best suited for an intended purpose. And I kind of wrote down what I would do if this were me in the class. And it has a bell ringer. It says, what is rust? What materials are susceptible to rust? And kind of getting them to think about it as a bell ringer just to kind of start the day. And then having them listen to an episode from Chemistry for Your Life, which is a podcast about, what it says. That is called What is Rust and Is It the Worst? And so some ways to kind of help your students while they're listening is A, giving them the transcript for them to follow along, and B, having them do some type of note taking, whether you assign them sketch notes or you assign them some guided notes or a graphic organizer, whatever it may be. And after listening, everybody comes together and kind of shares ideas and what they've learned, so that you as the teacher can identify any misconceptions and then come together to define rust and what causes it and its problems. And then as in the last 15 minutes of class, they are assigned different products and work together to determine what material each product should be made from in order to prevent rust, and then how you could differentiate your groups. But this is just a way that, yes, you could stand up in front of the class and lecture them about what rust is, or assign them something to read, or they could read the textbook. But the way the podcast explains it is a way that is, a little bit more engaging. And the podcast has somebody who is a chemist and then somebody who's not a chemist on it. And so you kind of get their perspective as somebody who isn't a chemist, and you get the chemist explaining it to someone. So it kind of makes them take on some more ownership and understand it in a way that our traditional methods don't. And there's an exit slip on there too. But in this presentation, in the slide back, I gave you a blank template of this lesson plan. So with the last 30 minutes, we would love to see you all come up with a way that you could implement a podcast into your classroom. And we are here as, people to bounce ideas off of, or to help you find a podcast, anything that we can do to help you be successful. But I think Paige and I are both pretty passionate about it because we've seen a lack in our curriculum for different voices and different topics and relevancy, and the free aspect of this and just the way that they're naturally engaging. Really, we're just huge proponents of it. And so we'd love to see that start happening more across the curriculum in every school and grade level. So, like I said, that sample lesson plan is on there. We'd love to see what you can come up with. And then also, you have the Wakelet of resources with tons of suggestions and lists. Or if you are already listening to a podcast or you are using them in your classroom, we would love to find out what you're using because we're always looking for new ideas, especially now that we're changing grade levels and need to start over. So shout them out. You can unmute to ask questions or you can throw them in the chat, whatever works best for you. And if you listen to a podcast that you love, even if it's not related to school and you think other people need to listen to it, throw that in the chat too, because I'm out of episodes of my usuals. Pamela, not all do. So most of the podcasts that are posted through NPR, so like This American Life and several of the other podcasts through NPR, they usually all have transcripts. All of Serial had transcripts for us. Some of them do not. It just kind of depends on how widely popular that podcast is. And I would say most are starting to add that just for the reasons of accessibility. That is, I've noticed more have transcripts now than they did before. Megan, what content do you teach?